My name is Jack Mandeville. I'm bald, fat, and I live in my rich friend's spare bedroom. And this is Jacked History. I enjoy learning about the history of the world. Current events are less of a concern of mine because of that. And a big reason why I typically don't get overwhelmed by the current state of human behavior or events is because the current state of human behavior is the same state of behavior that humans have always had. There's no such thing as a better or more simple time. Nobody before us had things figured out the right way. There are no major world events happening now that are any more important than what people experienced hundreds or thousands of years ago. We're just in an evolution of the same old bullshit, with longer life expectancies and better access to food. Simply put, to study history is to liberate yourself from many anxieties of the present. That's why when I hear someone hysterically going on about drone warfare and how the world will never be the same, I condescendingly say, as opposed to what other time? The creation of nuclear weapons? The implementation of manned aircraft in warfare? The use of mustard gas? I bet if you were an Aztec staring down the barrel of a Spanish musket in 1519, you were probably thinking to yourself that the world would never be the same. Furthermore, most of the world was probably a bit freaked out when they saw the Mongol horde show up to their city gates in the early second millennium. Things were never going to be the same once the Mongols were done with you. Or when I hear one of my fellow millennials or Gen Zers post something like, "I wish I was living in precedented times," when discussing the perceived world instability of the last 20 years. As opposed to what other time? Was there ever a precedented time? Just a little over 100 years ago, European nobility was being schwacked in droves. Was it the World War that brought the violent death and starvation of millions of people? Was it the Spanish flu that shortly followed that killed millions? Was it the economic disaster brought on by the stock market crash that made that time an easier time to live in than yours? Were those precedented times enough for you? And that's why, when I hear someone saying today that England is being invaded by outsiders, all I can condescendingly respond with is, as opposed to what other time? Today, we're talking about the Norman invasion of England and how it set the landscape for the England we think of today. And like most of my episodes, let's back it up before we get to the meat of the story. Before England and the British Isles of today, there was Doggerland, a land bridge that connected modern Britain to mainland Europe tens of thousands of years ago. And from the European continent, the first peoples would make their way across that land bridge to become the first occupants of the Britain we know today. By 6000 BC, the Ice Age had ended, sea levels had risen, and those Stone Age people were cut off from the rest of Europe. We don't know much about these people, but we still have a glimpse of their world today in places like Stonehenge. Then around 2500 BC came the Beaker people, a Bronze Age civilization that developed because of contact from mainland Europe. They developed tools, pottery, and a tribal system of living. In 800 BC came iron, and with it, the Celtic peoples that originated in Eastern and Central Europe. Britain was transformed into the most northern point of a vast Celtic culture that saw dozens of tribes on the island, all with their own hierarchies and pieces of land. And just like the Stone Age and Beaker peoples wouldn't last, neither would the Celts of Britain, because in 43 AD came the Romans. The Romans, Peter. Ever heard of them? The Romans?
I've heard of them.
Good. Very good. The Romans were, in my opinion, the basis of the world we live in today. And while the Celts made attempts to defend their land, they were no match. In the roughly 400 years of Roman occupation, they urbanized, Christianized, and modernized the southern part of the island. The Celts became the Roman Britons. But if you've been paying attention, you should know by now that nothing lasts forever in the British Isles. And in 410 AD, the mighty Roman legions left Britain as their empire crumbled, leaving the people they created to fend for themselves. And boy, it didn't take long for others to capitalize on the Roman military absence. Within the blink of an eye came the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. The Jutes, not the Jews. That's two different things. The Jutes and the Angles and the Saxons, whose native land was modern-day Germany and Denmark. This Anglo-Saxon invasion would once again throw the social and political order of the British Isles out of whack. Those Roman Britons who weren't on board with their new occupiers fled west into places like modern Wales, who were still clinging on to their Celtic roots. For the rest, Christianity, Latin, and Roman government was out, and paganism, Old English, and 7 new Germanic-based kingdoms were in. But it should be noted that almost 200 years later, Christianity came roaring back in popularity to the island. Okay, I suppose we should just assume this is where the English culture has been ever since, right? Wrong! The Anglo-Saxons, like the Romans, had roughly 400 years of influence before they too were about to meet another group of outsiders. The Vikings. We all know about the Vikings, sea raiders of Danish and Norwegian origins who never missed an opportunity to murder, pillage, and conquer. And since they were only separated by a small ocean, modern England and Scotland were ripe for the taking. By the 9th century, these Viking raiders had conquered most of northern and eastern England, leaving only a tiny portion of Anglo-Saxon England left, the Kingdom of Wessex. And it was in Wessex that English culture clung to life as Anglo-Saxon and Viking people intermarried over the years, and the line between the Viking and Anglo-Saxon peoples became increasingly blurred. Power on the island increasingly exchanged hands between the Norse and Anglo-Saxon rulers until 1066. Enter William I of Normandy, aka William the Bastard, aka William the Conqueror. It wasn't just Britain that was prone to Viking attacks. No, those Vikings were successfully conquering any chunk of land they could around Europe, unlike the Minnesota Vikings, who will more than likely never conquer a Super Bowl in my lifetime. William was the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo the Viking, who was the original conqueror of Normandy, a large chunk of land in northern France. Over the years, the Viking Norman rulers mixed and merged with the people of France and their political infrastructure, including their conversion to Christianity. So much so that the Normans had become a French Viking hybrid society. Basically, the Duchy of Normandy technically belonged to France, but they were left alone because of their Viking roots and fierce belief in their autonomy. So what you had was years of Norman rulers descended from Rollo who were hell-bent on running their own country over any real loyalty to France. It was in this Norman bloodline that William was born, the bastard and only son of Duke Robert I of Normandy. But unlike other European duchies and kingdoms of the time, the Normans had no strict rules about bastards ascending to power. So it was upon Robert's death in 1035 that 7-year-old William was set to become the Duke of Normandy. You can only imagine that William had to learn a lot of hard lessons in these years. His reign was constantly tested by older relatives and nobles who were vying to take power from the young Duke, and as a result, once he emerged victorious, William had developed a tough military and political mindset. In 1066, Edward the Confessor of England died without an heir, creating a Game of Thrones type of race to claim the English throne. Simply put, the Norse, Anglo-Saxon, and French royalty had become so intertwined over the years that there were numerous claims to the throne, including William's, who was a cousin of Edward. I'm sure most of you have seen it before. A family member with money and influence dies, and everyone starts getting real weird about who gets what. Harold Godwinson, the brother-in-law of Edward, was named his successor in January of 1066, shortly after Edward's death. But Harold III of Norway was also claiming that shit, so he landed in northeastern England in September of 1066, ready to take the throne by force. Of course, Harold Godwinson had to answer that by marching his English army up to meet Harold III to push him off the island, which he successfully did at the Battle of Stamford Bridge near York. Good for English Harold. He was able to defeat and secure his throne from Norwegian Harold. Case closed, right? Fuck no! Right as the two heralds were going at it, that bastard William I was landing his Norman force in southern England, ready to take the English throne by force. So, old Harold Godwinson had to march his tired army all the way down from northern England to southern England, where he met William at the Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066. Not only did William beat the ever-living shit, piss, and guacamole out of Harold, but he killed him too. Problem solved. Look at me. I'm the King of England now. England was now in the hands of the Normans, and William the Bastard was now William the Conqueror. The Duke of Normandy was now the King of England. The Norman invasion of 1066 fundamentally transformed the course of English history, politically, culturally, linguistically, and socially. So much so that many historians consider it the single most important turning point in English history. William wasted no time making England his pet project. First thing he does, he rebrands the country. Castles pop up everywhere like they're Starbucks. French lords replace English nobles faster than you can say croissant. Overnight, the old Anglo-Saxon elite got kicked out of their own country. It was like the Norman version of a corporate takeover. You want land? Cool. Swear loyalty to William, kiss the ring, and maybe you'll get a soggy farm near Scotland. Among the Norman nobles who followed William to England and was granted titles and land was a guy by the name of Geoffrey de Mandeville, which is why I, Jack Mandeville, believe I have a rightful claim to English lands, and I'll fight any one of those British bitch-ass peers for my rightful land. Anywho, culturally, the Normans were like the fancy cousins who show up to your barbecue wearing velvet. They brought in French words and fancy architecture. Old English became Middle English as the French language blended with the old Anglo-Saxon one, which is why English is still such a uniquely bastardized language today, thanks to that bastard, William the Conqueror. And not bastard like a bad guy, bastard as in, a literal bastard. And here's the kicker. Even though the Normans were technically French, they set England on the path to being a standalone European superpower that would go on to dominate half the world. England was no longer going to be known as a place for others to take over. They were going to be the ones invading others. The invaded became the invaders. Because hurt people hurt people. The end. Nothing scandalous or weird ever happened with English royalty ever again. Hey, just a reminder, Jacked History is on Pepperbox TV. And as always, please like, subscribe, leave a comment if you'd like, and share Jacked History with your friends. Do it, or I'm gonna give out Peter's address to the Anglo-Saxons so they can do a home invasion on him.